Hello, my name is Jackie Broxton. I'm the president and CEO of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation, and I'd like to thank you for spending time with me today. I share a little information about Bridget Biddy Mason. We're going to talk specifically about the trial that gave her her freedom, along with 13 other slaves. And I'd like for you to think of this as Now We Can Breathe, Biddy Mason and Hannah Embers. So first of all, let's look at the men who were involved with the trial itself. There was a slave owner, Robert M. Smith. Smith was originally from South Carolina. Both he and his wife came from slave-owning families. They married sometime around 1830 and moved to Mississippi. Land was being made available in Mississippi at the time as a result of the Indian Wars, and Native Americans were displaced from their lands and sent to other places. When Mississippi was discovered to be a great area to grow cotton. So Smith and his family moved there, and they weren't particularly successful. He became a member, he converted to the Mormon faith around 1844 and decided that he was going to sell everything and move to Utah. So he became part of a group that was known as the Mississippi Saints, and they moved from Mississippi to Utah, settling in a little town called Cottonwood. After he was in Utah for 3 years, that was at the end of the Mexican-American War, and there were huge tracts of land available in California at that time as a result of the breakup of the Spanish land grants. So he and another group, along with the larger group of Mormons, moved to the San Bernardino area. And when he arrived in California, he was the largest slave owner in the state at that time. The other man that's principal to this trial is Judge Benjamin Hayes. Hayes was born in Baltimore to a Catholic family. He planned to become a priest, and he later decided to become a lawyer. He eventually migrated west and was elected judge of Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Bernardino. He had served 4 years at the time of the trial in this position. When he rode on his circuit, he frequently visited the San Bernardino area, and he greatly admired the Mormons and felt that they were very industrious and orderly. Now, let's talk for a moment about the slaves themselves. They were all women and children. And if you look at the chart here, you'll see that Biddy Mason was 38 years old at the time of the trial. Her estimated value was $1,000. We're estimating the value based on the slave markets in New Orleans and Mississippi at the time. Her children are all shown here and their respective values. Biddy's was described as being stout, which means she probably was about 5'8", 5'9", large frame. And she had 2 daughters when Smith purchased her. Hannah, on the other hand, was 34 years old. Her value was estimated at $1,000, and she was pregnant at the time of the trial. Her children are listed here, and you notice that all of the children that are listed in red were born in either Utah or California. So then the question becomes, who was their father? And most historians agree that Smith or his sons were the fathers of these children. Hannah was described by Judge Hayes as being nearly white, which means that there probably in her bloodline had been a succession of white men cohabitating with Black slaves. Los Angeles, look at Los Angeles and San Bernardino at the time of the trial. You have the Mormon colony in San Bernardino with Robert Smith and the other Mormons who settled in the area. Smith was initially very successful with the land he selected, but the Mormons had failed to read the fine print of the deeds to the property in San Bernardino. They thought that they had over 100,000 acres, when in reality, they only had about 35,000 acres. The Land Claims Commission confirmed the total acreage and decided to let the Mormons have 35,000 acres that they could select from a larger tract of land. And unfortunately for Smith, they selected his land. He was not very happy. And in 1855, he paid off his annual tithe, sold cattle, and took his slaves, and then went to the Santa Monica Mountains. Now, the question always used to amaze me is, why did he go to Santa Monica? Why didn't he go to Lake Arrowhead or somewhere up in the mountains of San Bernardino? I think he was trying to protect his assets because the slaves were worth a lot of money, and he was going to need that money in order to go to Texas. The Black leaders who may have influenced Biddy Mason were definitely Robert Owens. There's a love story here. Robert Owens's oldest son was in love with one of Biddy Mason's daughters. So he was not interested in anybody taking her anywhere out of California. Robert Smith Owens had been very successful. He had migrated to Los Angeles in 1852, worked odd jobs while his wife worked as a laundress, until he got a contract with the government to supply cut wood, mules, and cattle. Later opened delivery stables. So he was a man of means. And then there was Elizabeth Flake Rowan in the San Bernardino area. She was actually given to James and Agnes Flake as a wedding present when she was 4 years old. She migrated to Utah with the Flake family when they converted to the Mormon faith. And after the death of James, Agnes, his wife, continued to travel to California with the colony. When she died, Elizabeth Flake Rowan was given her freedom. And she became a very active person. So we believe, we don't really have actual written proof, but we believe that between Elizabeth Flake Rowan and Robert Owens, they were able to persuade and convince Biddy Mason to file a petition for her freedom. Now, there were several things that Judge Hayes had to take into consideration. First of all, there was the California Fugitive Slave Law of 1852. This law gave slave owners 1 year to claim slaves who had escaped to California prior to 1850, when California became a state and entered the Union as a free state. Well, technically, it doesn't really apply to the case. I'm sure Judge Hayes had to take it into consideration because there was a lot of pro-slavery sentiment in California at the time. The other thing that Judge Hayes had to take into consideration was Robert Hayes Smith's actual behavior. He was very thuggish. He intimidated the defense counsel, bought them off with $100 to drop the case. He tried to lure two of Hannah's younger children away from the group. And then this whole idea of transporting everyone to the Santa Monica Mountains. And then there was public sentiment that had to be taken into consideration. California had been admitted to the Union in 1850 as a free state, but by the mid-1850s, pro-slavery newcomers had become the dominant political party. The Bella Union Hotel in downtown Los Angeles was a known hangout for Confederates. El Monte was the birthplace of the Klan, so he had to take all of this into consideration. And then maybe the overriding thing was that Texas law prohibited the importation of free Negroes. And Smith was maintaining that Biddy and the slaves were his family. So Smith fails to appear in court, and Hannah, Biddy, and their children are set free. The case received nationwide attention, and it started Biddy Mason on a life that would eventually make her an extremely wealthy woman.
Okay.
Thank you. What do we need to do? Oh, just jump in. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you,
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Well,
Take
thank
care,
you, Jackie, very much for the discussion
No,
about Biddy
thank you.
Mason and the court case and her life as she got to Los Angeles in those first few years. And as you said, she built an amazing life after that, became a major property owner in Los Angeles and was a community leader, not just in the Black community, but helping people of all ethnicities and races. Before we proceed too much further, I want to make sure that we acknowledge that long before the Workman and Temple families were here, and their stay was about 90 years. That's just a tiny fraction of the human history of our site. So we acknowledge that we are situated here at the museum on traditional, ancestral, and unceded Gabrielino, Tongva, and Keech land. We also recognize that the indigenous people of the territory are the traditional stewards here, and acknowledge and pay our respects to them, their ancestors, elders, relatives, and relations, past, present, and emerging, and recognize their cultural and spiritual connection to this place. My aim here is to talk about the African-American community from 1850 to 1900, looking at the census and other supporting information, and to give a better idea of what the community was like, maybe set the table for what happened as we got into the 20th century. As we look back to the early days of Los Angeles, we have to think about how much has been lost in terms of the history, or was not really allowed to be presented, was repressed, for example, and that will certainly be the case with African Americans in Greater Los Angeles. When the Pueblo of Los Angeles was founded in 1781 during the decaying Spanish Empire days, a very remote frontier part of what was called New Spain, of the 44 pobladores that founded the Pueblo, a considerable number of them had African ancestry. This is a rendering of the original plan for Los Angeles at that time. So from the beginning, there was representation of African ancestry among the population of Los Angeles. The community grew very slowly during the Spanish period, a little more emphasis on population growth during the Mexican period. Here's an image of the end of the Mexican era as you're transitioning to the American period of the Plaza area, which is off to the right, the Plaza Church at the center, and just to the above or to the northeast of the Plaza Church was Wine Street, now known as Alvera Street. Union Station would be off towards the upper right of the image. The Mexican-American War was a huge part of the transition period, the invasion by American forces in the 1846 and 1847 period, and some of the earliest Black residents of Los Angeles came as part of that invasion. The gold rush was another titanic change in what was happening in our region, primarily because the discovery of gold, of course, brought so many people from different parts of the world, China, the Philippines, Hawaii, South America, Central America, the Eastern United States, as well as Europe, and people coming to a place with very little organization in terms of government, law enforcement, courts, and so forth. And there were also African Americans who were brought mostly as slaves as their owners sought to try the gold fields out. And there was an obvious conflict there because California was set up through its Constitution of 1849 as a free state. It didn't mean that there was any idea of abolitionist sentiments or in terms of equality, but a lot of that really was that the idea was to keep out labor that was going to be detrimental to free white labor, as they often called it, or white labor that would be paid an adequate wage. In any case, there was a growth of the African-American population in California during the gold rush years. As the transition happened here in Los Angeles, this first survey that was done in 1849 is representative of changes going on in our region. On the bottom, you see the layout of the community as it was largely done by the Spanish and Mexican residents of the area. It didn't have the uniform layout you see at the top. That was the American system, but it didn't need to. The system that was existing for residents of Los Angeles before the American period worked just fine for them. The imposition of straight lines is really representative of control of the land, and control of land, of course, affects people in many different ways, including African Americans who are going to be living here. Where are they going to be living in terms of prices, and later on in terms of restrictions that are built in to covenants and deeds and that sort of thing. So as we start with the 1850 census, one of the things to point out is that there was only one enumerator for the entire county, and there was a vast undercount because of that. John Evertson, who wound up living in San Gabriel, had a population total for Los Angeles City of 1,610. and for the county of 3,530, but it was considerably more than that. In fact, the entire census for California was so low in its count that it was decided to create a state census in 1852 that would hopefully be more representative. And I mean that literally, because the population would determine how many members in the House of Representatives you would have from a given state. The 1850 census, flawed as it is, counted about 14 African Americans, although a few of them were Latinos, counted as Black, and perhaps they were mulatto, perhaps Everson thought they were Black. It's really hard to know that. But it was a small group of people very early here in Los Angeles history. The 1852 census wound up having about 34 African Americans counted. Most of them came in a very specific group. And this listing here in the sheet on the very bottom is Peter Biggs, who was a barber and who came with the invading American force. He was a resident of this area for about 20 or more years. And so it was one of the few Black residents of Los Angeles in these early years. The majority came from one group brought here from Utah by Mormon slave owners, and this sheet reflects that. All of the people listed here, including those who unfortunately their names were cut off by the loss of the sheet on the bottom left corner, which you can very clearly see. This is true for basically all the sheets, but it does list first name only for these African Americans. The fourth column over, or fourth main column over, shows laborer. Of course, they are not laborers, they were slaves. And two columns over from that, it shows that they had come from Utah. And Jackie talked about that, Robert Smith, and bringing these folks down from Utah to first San Bernardino, and then in doing whatever he could desperately to try to keep them together so he could take them to Texas, he took them to the Santa Monica Mountains. But in 1852, when this census was taken, they were out in San Bernardino. On this list is Biddy Mason. She is listed as number 29, and there are other members of her family and others as part of that group. The 1850s was a very interesting period in terms of where Los Angeles was going. The gold rush brought a lot of new residents, many of them from the American South. You had new communities being started, for example, El Monte, which was largely populated by white Southern Americans. Later in the 1850s, you have Anaheim, which was a German-American vineyardist colony. And this image is a good example, perhaps, of two things. Number one is the representation of Los Angeles that may be reasonably accurate, but also highly sanitized. And number two, it shows a lot of the retention of the structures and the ways of life that were in the pre-American period. So in the very foreground, bottom left, for example, you've got an Orno, an outdoor oven, that would be reflective of how life had been before. Again, it's a sanitized image. It was not this clean and neat, but it is a representation of LA at that time before we had photography. There's not a lot of information available for the Black community in the 1850s in Los Angeles. The freedom suit, the habeas corpus suit that Jackie talked about, was given some pretty detailed attention in the Los Angeles Star in January 1856. How much of this was of human interest and how much of it was concern about what this could mean for future issues involving Black residents, including slaves brought to California, is an interesting question. The major decision, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court of the United States, came along in 1857. So it's an era in which there's a lot of concern about what would be happening with the legal rights of Black Americans. You do find occasional references like this one. The advertisement in the Los Angeles Star in 1855 for Peter Biggs, who I mentioned before. He was a barber of long standing in the community. And so this is just one of the very few examples we can find. By the time you get to 1860, the population has grown to 88 African Americans. So it's reflective to a certain degree of the gradual population increase that took place during the previous decade. And so we have references, for example, to Louis G. Green, who was another member of the American military, meaning he was not a soldier, but he was an attaché, if you want to put it that way, to American officers, who was brought out here. He too became a barber as Peter Biggs had been, and that was an occupation that several Black men had during that era. On the left is part of the 1860 census sheet that shows Robert Owens, another prominent figure in the early Black community. Owens wound up having a contract to supply animals, and material for the United States Army. So the bottom part of the sheet, the last 20 or so names are soldiers, and the quartermasters are the suppliers for the Army. And just above them is Owens and his family, because he's there to supply and provide material for them. On the right is Lewis G. Green and others who are living in the community during that time. Another family to mention are John and Amanda Ballard and their children. John Ballard wound up living in El Monte for a period of time. This is 1860 census listing for him in Los Angeles, but he did come out to the San Gabriel Valley. And in 1863, in the tax assessment records, under William Workman, the owner of the Rancho La Puente with John Rowland and founder of the Homestead as we know it today, under him, there is a listing for Workman's John in quotes, and that's a possessive. That was John Ballard, who was an employee, but was seen as almost a possession of William Workman. It's reflective of a lot of issues about just how much freedom Black residents had in certain areas. And so Ballard was working for William Workman, but he was almost considered as if he was his property. Oscar Smith is another individual mentioned on this sheet. So you'll see in a column having to do with race that the letter B will be used for Black. They don't show W for white here, so it's pretty obvious what the race of those folks are. And you will see occasionally IND for Indian as well. I mentioned the Ballard family, of course, with respect to El Monte. They later wound up in Los Angeles, and eventually John Ballard got a homestead in the Santa Monica Mountains. And Patty Coleman, who is an instructor out in Moore Park College, has done a ton of research about the Ballard family and was one of many who was spearheading a change of a landform, a mountain, from a pejorative to Ballard Mountain. So it's a way to acknowledge the humanity of these people in a way that had not been done for many, many years. Another side note about the 1860 census, and other censuses for that matter, is the mortality schedule, where you can actually see what happened as people died within the previous year. And so in this case, Lewis G. Green's Latina wife is on here. And at the bottom are two sisters who died as young children. And of course, child mortality was very high for a variety of reasons. But sometimes you get good information by looking at these mortality schedules, as well as agricultural schedules, where you would find out what a landowner would have on their farm. And that may not necessarily apply to Black residents this early on, but information you can still get. 1860 also showing the listing of the Owens family, as well as Biddy Mason. And again, sometimes you see a change in terms of birthplace or age. Information will not necessarily be consistent. But when you can't find much information about the African-American community, you do tend to rely pretty heavily on the census. And that's why sometimes it's, again, good to go look at what the newspapers might say. You start seeing a little more information as time goes on. So as in the 1850s was pretty sparse with newspaper references. It gets a little better in the 1860s, but better is a certain word here we have to bear in mind, because sometimes the content can be very disturbing. So this is a reproduction of a letter written to Andrew A. Boyle, a prominent Los Angeles resident, namesake of Boyle Heights. His son-in-law was William H. Workman, nephew of William and Nicholas Workman here from the Homestead. Haight is the governor of California, and he is replying to Boyle and talking about the conditions that were going on in Reconstruction America and how it might apply to California and broadly. And so Haight specifically says to Boyle, the people of California love their free institutions too well to surrender them to the control of Chinese and Negroes. And he goes on to suggest that if conditions continue where Blacks are given too much control, as Haight sees it, it will lead inevitably to a conflict between the Blacks and the whites, and then the destruction of the government. And of course, this is hysterical commentary, but it's the governor of California who's saying this. There were some references that were interesting in terms of other conditions relating to Black people in California and Los Angeles, including the school system. So this is the Southern News, which was published here in Los Angeles. It was a union paper and therefore supporting the Republicans and the Union during the Civil War. It's 1862. There's an election taking place statewide, and this particular article concerns the election of the state superintendent of schools. Not something most people would focus on in an election, but during the Civil War, there was concern about the question of educating Black children as well as white children. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find an advertisement that has to do with businesses that involve African Americans in Los Angeles. So I mentioned Robert Owens before. John Hall was another early settler of the Black community here in Los Angeles. The pair of them owned a stable briefly in the early 1860s, and they continued their work beyond that. But again, it is helpful and informative to find these when you can get them. Similarly, I talked earlier about early barbers, and so I mentioned Louis G. Green. So this is an advertisement from the mid-1860s for his Colorado shaving and haircutting saloon. Green was even mentioned at one point because as the so-called Knight of the Razor and Soap, that had to do with soap, meaning his business as a barber, but also Knight of the Razor, he had a talent for carving. And so this was about a miniature clipper ship that was displayed in a hotel. It's a small bit of information, but whenever you can find anything relating to the African American community in Los Angeles, it's something to try to retain because it's, again, pretty rare. I'd mentioned Peter Biggs a couple of times previously. Unfortunately, he got involved in a couple of violent affairs in the late 1860s. The one on the bottom left was from 1869, and unfortunately, he was killed by a cook named Victor working in a restaurant in Los Angeles. One major feature of the Black community is the first AME church, and Jackie Broxton comes out of that church, very involved in it. And so the Biddy Mason Foundation has a relationship to that organization. This is an early reference to the church, a grand festival from 1869. They're selling tickets for the event at Stearns Hall, which is basically where US 101 and Main Street meet today, just south of the plaza. But you can see the names of those people involved. These are some of the early families of prominence, whether it's Mason, Owens, Smart, Hall, Ballards, the Peppers, and others. The 1870 census leads to a count of about 123 Black residents, up from 88 in 1860. There was probably a decline. There was a significant period in the first half of the 1860s with floods, droughts, smallpox, very dire economy. So some Black residents may have left, as would be the case for people of other ethnicities. But at the end of the 1860s, there is a change. The first significant and sustained period of growth, or a boom, takes place, and the population starts to dramatically increase. So 1870 is early in that process, but it does reflect to some degree probably what was happening. Out here, Rancho La Puente, there was a gentleman named Lewis Smith down at the very bottom who was working probably, almost certainly for John Rowland, since his name is with other laborers just below the Rowland family. And this is indicative, as we'll see with another example, of how Black residents of Los Angeles County were increasing in the hinterlands, not just in town, but more of them living, working on perhaps other people's farms, and in a few cases, even having their own farms. And another example here is of two youngsters, actually not one youngster and one adult, but Emily Smith and George Redding, who are residing with William Rubottom. Rubottom was a native of Missouri who had lived in Arkansas for quite a while, so a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner. And he has established himself in a place called Spitzzeri, named for a place that he had lived in Arkansas. And so Rubottom had a hotel and tavern in what is now Southwest Pomona. And so another example of a couple of early Black residents of the outlying areas of the county. At the bottom, it does show that there was a superimposition of the letters B for Black instead of C. That may have just been an error on the census taker's part. He was supposed to put B for Black rather than C for colored. But sometimes you wonder whether or not there was a reason for having a different way of wording these things or expressing the color. Another example from 1870, the Times family who are living in Wilmington Township. These townships were very broad, so they can encompass a lot of modern cities today. And we pretty good idea that this is actually Redondo Beach, because below the Times family is a guy named John Trudell, who ran a salt works that was located very close to where Redondo Beach Pier is today. The Green and Ballard family is listed in 1870 as well. Sometimes, again, like I said before, you see a change in terms of age or of birthplace. There are some indications that show that Green was born in South Carolina. One census said Jamaica. He was certainly from the American South. But you have to be mindful of this when you're going through census material about the varying information that can happen. The Ballard family shown below, as well as I said before. And some of these censuses do show the value of real estate and personal property. And that's relative. It's subjective to a certain extent because it's self-identified by the person who is being enumerated, but it gives you a glimpse perhaps into the relative wealth of people. So for Ballard, having $2,000 was obviously better than the person above him who had $300. Again, looking at the 1870s, more information is available through the newspapers and other sources. So some advertisements for Professor Green, as he was known, as well as Sam Jones and their barbershops, or tonsorial palaces, as the case may be. And again, a lot of these were located either next to or within hotels or in prominent areas, obviously, to get the maximum of the market available to you. With respect to Green, one reason why I became so interested in him was because I had gone years ago to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County at Exposition Park, looking for a photograph of the Temple and Workman Bank, owned by William Workman of the Homestead and his son-in-law, FPF Temple. And in finding this interior there, I wasn't surprised to see on the right prominent white men of the community, Cameron Tom, a longtime district attorney, also a strong Confederate supporter, as well as James Torberman, who became a mayor, and Aurelius W. Hutton, a prominent lawyer. That was to be expected. They are at the counter with Thomas W. Temple, one of the family members who was a cashier. On the far left is the manager of the bank. But in the background, next to the door, that was a surprise. And it's shown in a vertical format, but in brackets, it says Green, and then the janitor. And this was before the internet. It took me a little while to figure out who this was, but that was the Louis G. Green I've talked about briefly here. And it may be the earliest representation of a Black person photographically in Los Angeles, albeit in the background or on the margins, if you want to look at it that way. But it was definitely a surprise to see that. As you look at the Mason and related families, we can see here that Biddy is just below the household of her daughter Ellen and her son-in-law Charles Owens, who was a pretty successful individual, following in the footsteps of his father. Biddy herself had $3,000 worth of property, and as Jackie had explained, once Biddy got her freedom in 1856 and went to work for Dr. John Griffin, a prominent Southerner, she was able to save enough money over time to be able to buy her first property, and eventually had quite a large portfolio, not necessarily represented here. This is still the early days of her investing in real estate. In the county jail and city jail, we find of the 22 prisoners, there were 2 African Americans. So sometimes you learn information about a community in different ways. Later on, it could be, for example, the orphans asylum, or it could be the county hospital, where people are trying to get well from diseases. And so the way people are counted in the census may not always be a standard household as we think of it. That jail, by the way, is situated in this photograph center right. It's the 2-story building in the large dirt courtyard behind an adobe house that functioned for a long time as a Los Angeles County courthouse. The courthouse moved from the adobe building that, by the way, had been owned by Jonathan Temple and sold to the county in the early 1850s, to a 2-story structure towards the top left that Temple also built as a commercial structure. It didn't work that way very well because of a poor economy, so it wound up becoming leased out to the county, and that's where the courthouse is located. So the jail remained, though, in that location until the 1880s, and it was hardly a fit jail for almost anybody during that period. And as Jackie referred to, the people in the Biddy Mason court case were actually housed there for a while as they were waiting to get their court appearance. Other examples of individuals that don't get attention at all, but probably should, would be Caroline Burton, who is shown here in line 25 of this section of the 1870 census. She was an entrepreneur. The recording of her in the 1870 census shows her as a hair manufacturer. She was a hairdresser and owned her own business. She did this for almost 25 years in Los Angeles, and she frequently advertised. This one is from the mid-1870s, and it even states that she has just returned from San Francisco with goods for sale in the city of all types. And so she is somebody who deserves some attention. We don't know a lot about her life other than the fact that she owned this business here in Los Angeles. Another example of entrepreneurship among the African-American community during the 1870s would be the Barnum Restaurant and Chop House. I had actually seen this advertisement first. You don't really get indication that it's Black owned unless you look at something like a reference to the caterer-in-chief being an old Mississippi River steward. And at the bottom, in fact, the gentlemen were Horatio Martin and Jeremiah Redding. Martin was from the West Indies. Redding had other involvement in Los Angeles. Which one of them was the Mississippi River Steward is the question. But looking through our photograph collection one day, I was surprised to see that in the image on the left here, which is taken from the Pico House Hotel, looking towards Elysian Park and where Dodger Stadium is, you have the Plaza Church, very recognizable on the left. The adobe building to the right, though, does have the word Chop House, if you blow that up, on the adobe wall at the very far left corner. And there was a sign, if it's not there in this image, it would be in later ones, that says Barnum Restaurant. So it's always great to be able to correspond photographs with other information that you find, especially again, as you're trying to get information on the Black community this early on. The 14th Amendment was passed, and that in 1870 would allow for a Black male vote. But here in Los Angeles, it really meant that the county clerk was not just going to open the book up for registration without a fight. And so there had to be a test case. Lewis G. Green, in fact, was the person who filed for that case to force Mott, the county clerk, to record him as a voter and allow him to do so. But that is something that's going to be a big change, of course, in the 1870s. Unfortunately, there were many in Los Angeles County who were going to fight any attempts for Black people to be able to exercise their constitutional rights. This is from the 1871 Los Angeles News, which was part owned by Andrew Jackson King of a longtime El Monte family. The Kings were notorious for violent feuds with others. And there was also the El Monte Boys, a loose group of men who went out and supposedly were out to support legal authority, but often took the law into their own hands. In any case, whether King had anything to do with the writing of this or not, it refers to a person who's not even given a name, but called a 15th Amendment. That's what they're referred to as. Ignorant of the place in which they were, putting on airs, being insolent. It was said that this person was guilty of an impudent personal insult to a gentleman. Who knows what that actually meant, and therefore received a sound thrashing. If that wasn't enough, the little piece said that the Monte is not a good place for saucy Negroes and needs Ku Klux legislation because no one wants to be dominated by Negroes, which is an echo of what Governor Haight said in his letter to Andrew Boyle back in 1867. So things will gradually get better, but there's still plenty of racism, especially among the Southern Americans who tended to dominate Los Angeles politics and a good part of society for a good long time here in our region. There were positive things you can find, though, and this is an advertisement for a celebration of the enactment of the 15th Amendment. And so I mentioned Jeremiah Redding, John Hall, Horatio Martin, Lewis Green, Sam Jones, being committee of arrangements for this. Occasionally, you'll even find a newspaper article that will talk about the event and sometimes put that in fairly positive terms. Veterans of the Mexican-American War. One of those was George Smith, who's about in the center of this short article on the right side. He was a Black man who lived in Los Angeles for many years and was part of this Veterans Association, which would often go out and march at the Independence Day parade, for example, and other events. It's interesting sometimes you can find material about Black school children and the so-called color school. The school did move frequently during the 1870s, and sometimes the articles can be very short with not a lot of information. The one on the right, though, was particularly interesting, as it talks about the work being done by the 16 children who had unquestionably striven hard to make proper use of the advantages afforded to them. It talks about the fact that they did well with reciting poems or geography lessons, giving good answers in math, or expressing themselves well in song. At the end, it mentions the superintendent of schools here in Los Angeles City, Dr. William T. Luckey, who talked to the parents about, quote, the necessity and importance of regular and systematic attendance on the part of the children, and reminded them that they had placed at their disposal the same advantages that were accorded to others. Now, that's not actually true. White children had far more advantages in terms of resources than Black children did. So it's a mixed bag, but certainly to see some positive references is always good to see in the newspapers. We talked about Lewis G. Green earlier, a little story here, but also really representative of trying to upbuild the community. Green was the captain of the Temple Guard. Not sure where the name came from, unless it was situated on Temple Street, but in any case, it was a militia of African-American men, and it talks about application had been made for state arms. And green was also having the Guard be part of the Emancipation Day celebration from the mid-1870s. As we get into the 1880s, the population growth is again fairly moderate, from about 125 to close to 180. Again, there was a reason for that. There may have been a larger population in the first half of the 1870s when that boom that I mentioned earlier continued, but then there was an inevitable bust. The economy went into a tailspin in the latter half of the 1870s, and so there may have been an exodus of some Black residents, as it would be for other ethnic groups. In 1880, we find that the Ballard family had moved out to the San Fernando Township. That was really their homestead in the Santa Monica Mountains. The township embraced basically the entire San Fernando Valley. So in some cases, you see more migration into rural areas. Another example of migration is Lewis Green and the Andrew Chisholm family, who went out to Santa Monica. That community was established in 1875. When they had the auction or sale of lots in that town, there were a few Black buyers. So it wasn't that you couldn't buy land. It would be an economic issue, or maybe in some cases, if the land was considered to be out in the hinterlands, it was okay, as opposed to say in the city. Whatever the case may be, there was again migration to outlying areas of the county. Sometimes you find interesting permutations of the Black experience. So in the Azusa Township, the Badillo brothers established a coffee plantation. They were from Costa Rica, where of course that's a major crop. And at the very bottom of their household listing is Dennis Latone, a Costa Rican who was identified as Black. The plantation did not succeed. And later on, there was another development in that area that became the town of Covina. Biddy Mason, listed at the very top of this detail on Spring Street in Los Angeles, and given the occupation of midwife. As you can see in 1880, they did not have the listing of property values as they had had before, but she was definitely expanding her real estate portfolio during that time. Another example of mixed race and ethnicity is John Neville, a young man who is a ward, meaning a legal ward, of John E. Hollenbeck and Elizabeth Hatzfeldt Hollenbeck. John was from the Midwest. Elizabeth was from Germany. They had met in Nicaragua in the early 1850s. John was on his way to the California gold rush, but got stranded there. And they wound up living in that area for a good 20 years in Nicaragua and became very successful. When they migrated to Los Angeles, John Neville, who was part Nicaraguan and part Jamaican, came with them. So just another example of a different element of African ancestry in our city here. I mentioned the Hall family before. This was a particularly notable census listing because at the bottom, it shows the family with their several children. They're living on what's called a Santa Monica Road, otherwise known to us as Pico Boulevard. So they're on the outskirts of the city of Los Angeles at that time. But at the very bottom, it shows a ward, a white child named Moses. Moses because the child was left almost like in a basket in biblical terms. Jackie was referring to earlier to the fact that Moses may actually have been a light-skinned Black child that was left to the Hall family to adopt. There were newspaper articles about this incident that happened actually in 1878, where the baby was left on the doorstep. There seemed to be a lot more attention paid to why this would have happened with a white child being left in a Black household. And that might have been why there was some media coverage of this. But it does talk about a basket being left on the door containing this baby. More information that is again striking, and again, it's very, very brief here, but a woman in San Pedro was accused of enticing her daughter away from the home in which she had been placed because the mother had married a Black person. And therefore, there was a court case on habeas corpus, which again is about unlawful detainer or having somebody in your possession that you shouldn't have. And so the inference is pretty clear here that Michaela Brown, because she had married a Black person, wasn't really entitled to have her daughter with her. And in fact, the judge in this case wound up sending the girl to the Sisters of Charity, a Roman Catholic organization of nuns that had a home. And in fact, they had an orphan's home. So it's another example of this uneasy relationship between intermarriage and families during that era. Other examples of some positive things, though, we have more of the Emancipation Day celebration. And as I said before, sometimes you get a little more detail. So on the right, there is a listing of the program in terms of speakers and readings of poems and singing and what have you. And at the very bottom, the mayor of Los Angeles, Henry T. Hazard, did make an address. So there were occasions in which prominent white officials especially might go to these events being held by the African American community. Another reference to the First AME Church and the election of Board of Trustees, the church property at 4th and Charity Streets. Charity has been renamed. And so this is going to be in the area where Bunker Hill starts to move down towards Pershing Square. And that's where Biddy Mason had moved to, and where there was a small Black community in those days. By the 1900 census, now the 1890 does not exist. It was burned in a fire. What we do know is that the 1890 enumeration counted about 1,800 African Americans in Los Angeles County, which is a huge change from 1880. And that's reflective of a growing Black migration out of the South into other areas of the country. It is also about the change in Los Angeles. The railroad had a direct transcontinental link from about 1885 onwards. And so there was a major boom, much bigger than the late 1860s, early 1870s one. And so that would reflect with people of color in general. But by 1900, there's another big leap to about 2,800. And so it's a much larger community. About 600 or more of those live in the county, and about 2,150 thereabouts are within the city of Los Angeles. What we also see in a few examples are intermarried couples, interracial marriages. And so this is a detail from Long Beach, where Fred Watkins, a white man, is living with his African-American wife, Matilda. And that's something you wouldn't have seen earlier in Los Angeles necessarily, but will start to become a little more common as time goes on. Another interesting example of change, this is a listing for the Rancho Santa Anita, the ranch of Lucky Baldwin. Within a few years, the Santa Anita racetrack would open briefly and then shut down and be brought back later. But in any case, Baldwin was an avid raiser of horses for racing. And so he has a group here of white and Black employees, some Black jockeys and horse trainers and so forth as part of his household or the larger Baldwin Ranch. In Long Beach, and there may have been a particularly localized reason for this. In other words, the enumerator may have decided to do this, but a lot of people who were listed as Black were actually Latinos. And that's just a reminder that when you're looking at census material, you have to kind of go granular with some of this because it would change the recording, obviously. So if there were a certain number of African Americans stated in a book or an article, but you have to go back and look at the census to really figure out if that number is accurate enough. This is a good example of where that can come to the fore. There are 3 households here of the Valenzuela family. The birthplaces are all Mexico and California. Is it possible that there was some African ancestry? Of course there was, but more than likely, the enumerator looked at these Black-skinned Latinos and decided they should be recorded as Black. I also saw that occasionally with other ethnic groups, such as Greeks, in a few isolated instances. Out in Newhall, this is in the northern part of Los Angeles County, there are only a few Black people listed, but in this case, it happened to be the Ashbridge family, where George, the husband, is a barber, and his wife, Jane, is the hotel keeper. So another example of entrepreneurship. Barbering was a very common occupation, as we talked about, with Black males, but to have a couple be able to own a hotel is something a little bit different in our community. Sometimes also it's finding those stories of single women. In this case, Minnie Smart, who had been divorced. The Smart family lived in Los Angeles for quite a long time. She is living with her several children in the San Antonio Township, which is not a name a lot of us recognize outside of Texas, but that is an area south of Los Angeles. Above it, it does say Florence Precinct. So the Florence community is south of Los Angeles. And they wound up being sort of pioneers in the sense that a lot of Blacks would migrate further south from downtown Los Angeles to this area later, South Los Angeles and into South Central. But Minnie is here farming and raising her children as a single woman. As I mentioned before, the city of Los Angeles had the lion's share of the Black population, over 2,100 living in different wards of the city. There were 9 at that time. In some of the wards, the Black population was almost exclusively servants. This would be especially true on the west side. Bunker Hill southwest part of Los Angeles near USC and Exposition Park, where the wealthier white families lived. And so you'll find coachmen, you'll find household maids, governesses, that sort of thing in those areas. The bulk of the Black population, not surprisingly, lived in more of the industrial commercial area of Los Angeles, especially south of what is now US 101 and east of Alameda, where there still is an industrial component there, although there's an arts colony now that is springing out. But most of the Black population lived there because it's proximity to the work, including the growing railroad areas, the yards and the train stations. So Black male porters and other workers living in these areas. There is a small community on the east side as well. Evergreen Cemetery was established in the late 1870s in an area on the eastern fringe of the city that was not considered the most desirable in terms of the type of land involved. And so a Black community sprung up around Evergreen Cemetery. It's more affordable for them, and or with de facto segregation, that's pretty much where they could live. Later on, Boyle Heights and parts of South and South Central Los Angeles were specifically areas that people of color could live because they were not restricted by deeds or covenants. In 1900, that's not quite the case yet, but that will be coming down the road in the 20th century. Sometimes you find these little examples that are really great to see because you get a story out of it. And so in this case, there is a 6-year-old whose parents had died, as Jackie mentioned during our presentation, of tuberculosis. And so he's being raised by a childless couple. The young man is listed here at about line 35 as Paul William. He is at school, but he wound up becoming Paul Williams, the very famous architect, first Black graduate of the architecture school at USC, and architect to a lot of people in the film industry and so forth. I had mentioned the core of the Black community being downtown, a little Tokyo area, again, east of Alameda, and then moving further south, basically along Central Avenue. This is Wall Street, which still exists today. And so a listing of the Roberts family, Andrew and Ellen Roberts. Ellen happened to be a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And their son, oldest child, Frederick, later, he's 20 years old in 1900, but later on became the first African-American member of the California State Assembly. Over on East 5th Street, another area of concentration for African-American residents was John J. Nemore, who was the founder of the California Eagle newspaper. The Eagle was a very important part of the Black community. One of Nemore's successors was Carlotta Bass, a woman of immense influence in Black Los Angeles. And so it's good to see that you can find this kind of information back in the census records. The Eagle is available on newspapers.com, by the way, so it can be very helpful for finding research on Black residents. So as we conclude, the idea again here was to take census and other material from 1850 to 1900 and try to get a better idea of what the African-American community was doing, and then laying the groundwork, if you will, for being able to interpret better what life was like for Black Angelenos as that community grew substantially in the 20th century, especially up through 1950. And so the article on the left deals with Black professionals in Los Angeles. It's about 1909. In the center on the third row is John Somerville, who was an early Black dentist here. And on the right, not in the article, but a separate article, is his wife, Veda Somerville, who spent some of her childhood out in Pomona and Chino before living in Los Angeles. And she became the first Black woman dentist in Los Angeles. Well, being able to tell their stories hopefully is amplified by what went before them, because you could look at Veda Somerville as a direct descendant, not blood-wise, but in terms of occupation or influence as a Biddy Mason descendant. So that was the hope here in this presentation. So hopefully Jackie and I were able to give you a good grounding on some of that early history. And again, thank you for joining us today, and look for more programs from us dealing with Black history in Los Angeles. Thank you again.